Today I'm going to talk about our analysis of the current draft of the new TLS 1.3 standard. I'm Jonathan Hoyland, and my colleagues are Kaz Kramers at the University of Oxford, Marco Horvat at the Max Planck Institute, and Sam Scott and Tyler van der Marve, who are both at Royal Holloway with me. So in this talk, I'm going to give you a brief history of TLS, on the background and the development process for TLS 1.3, before going on to talk about our analysis, our results, and the impact of our work. So what we did was we did a comprehensive analysis of TLS 1.3, which has a symbolic analysis and has great scope. We're going to talk about our findings, which we used to improve the specification, which we used to create a feedback loop. And finally, we produced an annotated version of our model to allow other people to evaluate and potentially extend our work. So the annotated model is available on the web, and it lists all of our assumptions and modeling choices, making understanding our work and its limitations much easier. So the history of TLS. TLS is a protocol for establishing a secure channel over a potentially hostile network, and it's probably most commonly seen as the transport layer for HTTPS. So this is a timeline of TLS editions, and as you can see, TLS started out life as SSL, and new versions have come out over the last 20-odd years, with TLS 1.2 coming out in 2008. So why do we need a new version of TLS 1.3, of TLS? Well, given its prevalence, TLS has been attacked over the years, and a lot of weaknesses have been found in the current version of TLS 1.2, including things like Heartbleed and Freak and Sloth. And as you can see from this chart, the number of successful attacks has been increasing exponentially, and so a new version is needed. TLS 1.3 is a draft protocol standard at the IETF, and the drafting of TLS 1.3 started in 2014, and input was sought from both industry and academia. And in fact, formal analyses of the spec were commissioned by the TLS working group. TLS 1.3 has similar security goals to TLS 1.2, but the protocol itself is very different. So for example, TLS 1.2 requires 2 round trips to build a secure connection, whereas TLS 1.3 requires only 1. Several new modes were added from TLS 1.2. The 0 round trip time mode was added so that a pre-shared key can be used to send data securely in the first message. And another mode that was added was the post-handshake client authentication mode that lets a client authenticate himself after the handshake was completed. So a big break from TLS 1.2 was dropping support for older, insecure cipher suites and algorithms. So for example, all insecure hash functions like MD5 and SHA-1 have been explicitly unsupported. Although this reduces backwards compatibility, it was decided that that was preferable to keeping known weak ciphers available. Support for RSA key exchange was also removed because it didn't provide perfect forward secrecy, and in TLS 1.3, only ephemeral key exchanges are allowed. So perfect forward secrecy is the requirement that if a long-term key is compromised, then sessions completed before the compromise are still secure. So some TLS 1.2 cipher suites do provide PFS, but in TLS 1.3, all cipher suites are required to support PFS. So in short, TLS 1.3 has some new requirements, operates very differently to TLS 1.2, and this means that analyses of TLS 1.2 do not hold for TLS 1.3, and new analyses are needed. So this slide is a timeline of TLS 1.3's development. The lower row in dark blue is the drafts of the TLS 1.3 specification, with some highlighted for reference. And the upper row in light blue are the papers published about the spec. And as you can see, the papers, there have been quite a lot of papers about TLS 1.3, and they seem to bunch up around conferences. But there have been 21 drafts of TLS 1.3, as opposed to only 10 drafts of TLS 1.2. So you might think, why do we need another analysis of TLS 1.3? Because there are loads. And the main reason is the TLS spec is really a moving target. And every few drafts, there'll be major structural changes that invalidate the previous analyses as problems are addressed or new features are added. So, for example, Kramers et al. Did a previous symbolic model, found a complex attack involving 18 messages across 3 modes in draft 10, following which there were major structural changes and a complete overhaul of the session resumption mechanism. So this is us. And as you can see, most of the analyses previously are of earlier drafts. So this is why our analysis is useful. So I'm now going to talk about our analysis. The goal of our analysis was to look at TLS 1.3 as a whole, rather than looking at each mode and feature of the protocol individually. A number of the analyses of TLS 1.3, which I showed on the previous page, focused on the core handshake, or they implicitly or explicitly excluded parts of the protocol. Whereas our goal was to look at all of the modes and their interactions. So we built a symbolic model of the spec and wrote properties to try and prove the specification upholds the security guarantees it claims. We use a symbolic model to analyze the spec rather than a particular implementation, because we want to know about the correctness of the spec. So our symbolic model means we don't consider implementations. So for example, we treat cryptography as a perfect black box. And we don't really consider what would happen if, say, someone broke AES, because from TLS's perspective, the specific cipher you use is irrelevant to the correctness of the protocol. We also don't directly model implementation errors in the client or the server. We just give the attacker certain abilities. So for example, we don't model an implementation error, we just allow attackers to leak a key. And that lets us, again, focus on the correctness of this protocol. And that gives us the broadest scope we could manage. And as I've just mentioned the attacker, I want to talk about him now. We have to model quite a powerful adversary to meet the attacker model of TLS 1.3. And the adversary we use is based on an extended Dolev-Yao adversary. So a Dolev-Yao adversary is one that can intercept, modify, and replay any message, and is restricted only by the information that he can learn or discover. We extend the Dolev-Yao model to allow the attacker to compromise long-term keys, pre-shared keys, and Diffie-Hellman exponents. And unsurprisingly, if the attacker can learn all the secrets, TLS is not secure. However, by specifying our properties in terms of what actions the attacker takes, we're able to write very granular properties that capture exactly which secrets must be kept and when. So to return to my example of perfect forward secrecy, we want to reason about the security of completed sessions if a long-term key is compromised. So by granting our attacker the ability to compromise long-term keys, we can reason about the security of sessions before the compromise occurred. So this makes our lemmas very informative, because they help establish the minimum requirements for each security guarantee and the relative importance of each key. I'll return to the topic of our lemmas in a moment, but first I want to discuss the tools we used. So our main tool was Tamarin, which is a security protocol verification tool. And the idea of Tamarin is that you write a model and some properties, and then either manually or using the built-in automated prover, you show that the protocol satisfies the properties. We chose Tamarin as our tool because Tamarin has native support for loops, which I'll return to in a minute, Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which is a core part of the TLS handshake, and can prove properties on an unbounded number of runs with an unbounded number of actors and fresh values. So Tamarin is also very good at analyzing protocols with a lot of state, such as TLS. So to return to loops, TLS is an extremely complex protocol with all kinds of weird and wonderful features that can make it hard to analyze. For example, loops. So the TLS protocol can loop, i.e., during a run of the protocol, it can return to an earlier section of the protocol, allowing a single run of the protocol to continue effectively indefinitely. And Tamarin's inductive reasoning features allowed us to break out of these loops and prove the properties we wanted. So for a protocol as complex as TLS, with its huge messages and complex control flow and nuanced properties, trying to model the entire protocol in one piece could have made our model very brittle and difficult to adapt to new drafts. However, using macros to substitute in each piece of the protocol, we were able to modularize the protocol into a number of discrete sections, and this let us construct our model in pieces and only integrate them as we came to prove the model. This gave us the flexibility to edit a message in a single place rather than at each occurrence, or to exclude modes under construction without having to carefully thread our way through the code. And this gave our model the flexibility to adapt to new drafts as they came out without huge remodeling efforts. So, as I've mentioned, TLS is a complex protocol, and our modeling project began over 2 years ago. However, TLS is a moving target as new drafts come out and modes are proposed and modified, and the model itself took thousands of hours to build and to prove. And even verifying the proof takes dozens of gigabytes of RAM and many hours. We invested thousands of hours in building our model in a modular way, which paid off when new drafts came out, and capturing the changes and redoing the analysis took only a few months rather than requiring us to rebuild the model from scratch. So now I want to return to the topic of the properties we prove about TLS. As I mentioned earlier, the properties we prove about TLS are relatively nuanced. And it's not just as simple as saying TLS is secure or TLS is not secure. And I want to briefly discuss one of the issues we found that we raised with the working group. So this is an issue that actually does not break the security guarantees, but is an awkward corner case where the behavior you get is not the behavior you might expect. And that could cause problems if it's not accounted for correctly. So the issue is as follows. And TLS has two authentication modes, unilateral and mutual authentication. And in unilateral authentication, the server proves its identity to the client, but the client does not identify itself to the server. And in mutual authentication, both parties have to prove their identity. So we analyzed these modes, and we found that, indeed, neither party will ever be misidentified as some other party. However, we did notice something odd about the way this operated. So I'm just going to walk through a brief example. So in this example, the client will send a client hello, the first message, and the server will reply with a server hello and a certificate. The client then responds in mutual authentication mode with his own certificate, whereupon the client and the server have successfully shared mutually authenticated keys and have established a mutually authenticated secure channel. However, if you take a step back, the server is allowed to silently reject the client certificate, but still continue with the protocol. And this might seem strange because you might expect that a security failure, so a certificate failure, might bring down the connection. However, because it's better to have some encryption than none, it was decided to allow the server to optionally fall back silently to unilateral mode. However, this leaves the client in an ambiguous situation because he doesn't know if the server considers him authenticated or not. And this might seem like a trivial issue. However, consider a situation where a server logs the actions of unauthenticated users to a public or an insecure log, and the actions of authenticated users to a secure log. And in this case, a client might perform sensitive actions thinking he's authenticated, whilst the server logs those actions to a public log. And this mismatch between the client and the server's perceived state is actually within the security guarantees provided by the protocol. However, it's a behavior that could cause problems if misunderstood. So I just showed that the security properties of TLS are quite nuanced, and I've mentioned that TLS itself can change quite dramatically between drafts. And so it's actually very hard, even for experts or people who are very immersed in this field, to evaluate exactly what each piece of research claims about which draft, and with what caveats. So as you can see here, there have been a lot of papers on the security of TLS 1.3, and most of them refer to prior drafts, and all of them have different methodologies and consider different aspects of the protocol to varying levels of detail. So one of our outputs is actually to produce a website that we think will make the community's life a little bit easier. And on the site, we have the text of the RFC, or the specification document, and on the right, we have a note and an explanation of our model. And those explanations can include things like direct extracts from our model, which we try to align with message formats in the spec, so you can compare side by side. We have explanatory notes that explain how our model captures the expected behavior. And finally, we have the why. We explain why we choose to model things in one way rather than another. And together, these form a virtually complete explanation of exactly what our model covers, how we abstract it, and exactly what is going on throughout our model. This makes our research much more useful for the community because they can see what we cover and what we don't, allowing them to focus their research on the areas of the spec that are less studied. So moving on to our third result, having said that the security of TLS is not just a simple yes-no proposition, I'll now try and give you a yes-no answer to the guarantees of the security of TLS. So in the RFC, there are 8 security guarantees given in the handshake, for the handshake rather. And our model suggests that TLS 1.3 does establish the same session keys for the client and server, and those keys are confidential. As I said earlier, peer authentication appears to hold, but there are some potentially confusing corners in the mutual authentication case. Our model also shows that the session keys that are established are unique, and as I'll talk about on the next slide, we managed to provide some guarantees of downgrade protection, but they are not as strong as we might like. Perfect forward secrecy appears to hold where the spec claims it should. So for example, in zero round-trip time mode, perfect forward secrecy is given up for data sent before the handshake completes, and that's to allow for faster connections. And you don't have to use zero RTT, so if you want perfect forward secrecy, you can not use it. But as far as we can tell, perfect forward secrecy holds where it claims it should. KCI resistance appears to hold, and we considered the protection of endpoint identities, so that's a privacy property out of scope. So I will briefly touch on some of the limitations or areas for future work of our research. As I said on the previous slide, the properties we prove about downgrade protection could be stronger. And our ability to prove resistance to downgrade attacks is a little restricted, actually, by our approach. So for example, because we don't have a model of TLS 1.2, we cannot check whether a client and server that both support TLS 1.3 can be forced to use TLS 1.2. Building a model of TLS 1.2 would allow for this important area to be verified. Also, because we assume cryptography is perfect, we don't check whether the protocol is secure when used with weak cipher suites. Extending our model to allow the attacker to break cipher suites would allow us to write lemmas that can reveal exactly what properties a cipher suite needs to provide TLS's security guarantees. Currently, we require cipher suites to be unbroken, but this doesn't tell us what a future break in a cipher would do to TLS. We do prove that the client and server agree on the parameters chosen and that group negotiation works as expected, but more detailed modeling of downgrade attacks would give more precise guarantees. The TLS spec includes some guarantees of privacy, which we just considered out of scope. So, in conclusion, our main contributions are that we prove that many of the properties in the spec hold under our model. We built a website that lets people evaluate and understand our research, and we discovered a subtlety of the client mutual authentication status and added a section on mutual authentication to the specification document. Thank you.
So Brian Parno, Carnegie Mellon. So it's very nice work, especially like the website part. Could you talk a little bit more about sort of lessons learned along the way? So the main thing you said was make it modular, which I think we all agree is a good idea, but is there more specific design decisions that you made that worked out well or that did not work out well?
Actually, yeah, and you should consult the website. We talk about that. I didn't realize how illegible that would be. But like, there were actually a lot of pieces of the model which were correct, but actually very inefficient to check. And so there was a lot of work in how to construct a model that requires less space to verify, even if it is equivalent to some other model. And that, I think, actually is just, I guess, a function of modeling expertise with a specific tool. But yeah, in terms of lessons learned, mostly try and keep everything as tiny as possible.
Cool. And at this point, are you sick of Tamarind, or are you excited about what you can do with it?
I'm still using it for my next two projects, so okay. I think I'm a convert.
Okay.
So I would like to follow up this question. How much of the model can be reused if TLS has a new draft?
Assuming that the changes aren't too substantial, all of it. So, in fact, when the latest draft 21, came out, we barely needed to change anything. And actually, the drafts generally don't change dramatically. Like, draft 10 was a big change, and draft 6 was a big change. But generally, the drafts don't change so much, and so the model can evolve to keep up with those drafts.
So how much of the work is automated? If you have a new draft, a new model, what portion of the work is manual work and how much is automated?
So this is the slide I cut. We basically, to prove the 8 guarantees, we had about 30, give or take, lemmas that we had to prove, of which about 20 you can prove automatically using the Tamarind's built-in prover. and then the rest generally have to be proven manually, although with more work, it could easily be made to prove more of those automatically. We're just hoping that there's not going to be another draft, so that work will be unnecessary.
So, based on your experience, proof is are proofs for global systems special or comparable to software verification in general for other software? I guess what I'm asking is for the theorems, lemmas you proved, are those particular to global systems, or some of those can be reused, or proof techniques can be reused?
I'm not sure how much of Tamarin you could reuse outside security domain, but the lessons learned from proving, I guess, could be transferred. I don't know if that really answers your question.
Hi, Adam Petcher from Oracle. I'm curious how your model and your analysis handles TLS extensions, and can you model them easily? Does it cause a combinatorial explosion in your analysis? Anything related to that?
So we actually model TLS extensions as just part of the TLS spec. So it's not really, well, I mean, it is an extension, obviously, but it's all of a single piece. And I mean, it doesn't, as far as I can tell, it doesn't really cause an exponential explosion, because by careful modeling, you can try and keep your bounds relatively tight. I guess if you added something really crazy, it would be, but generally it just works fine as a single piece.
Any more questions? All right.
Yeah, I guess for the question with respect to how much would be transferable to verifying software in general, maybe if defining the state machine of the program can be done by using this multi-set rewriting kind of techniques, where all you have is loops and branching and unbounded maybe executions. Then I guess Tamarin could be used, but it's mostly tailored to security protocols.
How do you compare to verification with other systems like Coq?
Well, Coq is it allows for much more to be done, but it's also very non-automated. So here you can maybe have some proofs that are done automatically, or at least parts of the proofs.
Yeah, especially proofs you're doing for a second time, which is very useful.
Let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.